What's up, media theory people? Welcome to another short lecture. Today we're going to talk about Kellner again, but this time we're going to talk about political economy and how it relates to cultural studies. You might have noticed that this article starts in a way that is quite similar to the way that he begins his other article on multiculturalism in cultural studies. So it's very similar. However, this reading really gets into the history of cultural studies and places more emphasis on the role of what we call the study of political economy in relation to the field of cultural studies. And political economy, or what I call PE in these slides, has to do with factors including money, right? Media ownership, who owns what, who funds different kinds of media, the media itself, the government, and power, right? So primarily, political economy is interested in money and power, those two things. And of course, those are related. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what we're doing here. So Kellner talks about political economy a lot without really delving into specificity about what political economy does. So political economy, just so you know, deals with issues, again, of capitalism, right? So money and who has it, who owns what. Media ownership, again, that who owns what, right? The support for media organizations, so things like advertising, marketing, social media, and so on. Government policy and regulation, which of course affects production. Globalization, which is the tendency of the world to be interconnected in terms of trade and flows of people and money. And then finally, what we call neoliberal economics. So here, liberal doesn't mean what it usually means in a political context. So when we talk about neoliberal economics, what we're talking about is a very specific kind of economics or economic approach that calls for the deregulation of industries, right? So people who are neoliberal economists don't want a lot of rules or regulations governing business. They're in favor of privatization, so that means they're in favor of taking government-run programs and turning them over to private industry. So examples of privatization would be things like privately owned prisons, privately owned garbage collection companies, right, that come around and collect your garbage instead of the county. All right, private schools, right? These are all examples of privatization. They're also in favor of lower trade barriers. So they want people to be able to trade, countries to be able to trade with one another without a whole lot of economic hindrance or obstacles getting in the way. So these are the things, in essence, that political economy really concerns itself with, right? Again, the reason we call it political economy is because these are all things that deal with politics or economics, right? And so with this in mind, now we can talk a little bit about Kellner and what he thinks. So in his intro, and this should sound familiar, he goes over why it's important to study the media. And again, he says, listen, media gives us a sense of who we are. It gives us an idea about what it means to be male or female. It lets us know where we figure into the class hierarchy in this country. It gives us an idea of how we're supposed to act according to our ethnicity and race. It gives us an idea of what it means to be, in our case, Americans. It teaches us about sexuality and how we're supposed to behave with regard to that whole mess, right? And then finally, it also gives us, of course, an idea of us and them. So it gives us an idea of community, but it also gives us an idea of who's not part of our community, right? So he goes on, he says, this shapes our view of the world as well as many of our deepest values, good or bad, positive or negative, moral or evil, right? All these things are things that we learn, obviously, through our families, but we also learn it through our experiences with media, right? With movies, with television shows, with newscasts, through books, through websites, through videos, right? We learn all these things from our exposure to media. And so he says this media provides the symbols, myths, and resources through which we constitute a common culture. So what he's talking about here, and this idea is a little dated at this point, but what he's saying is that media unites us in a way, and makes us feel as if we're part of a larger community. This idea goes back to Benedict Anderson and his ideas of imagined communities, where he says that nation states, like the United States, for example, are in essence just imagined communities. There's nothing that really unites us other than the idea that we believe that we're all united, right? And that's what makes us Americans, for example. And he says that part of what does this is our exposure to media, right? It gives us an idea of what it means to be an American, and gives us this identity as being part of a national community or a common culture. And then finally, he says, media spectacles demonstrate who has power and who is powerless, who's allowed to exercise force and violence, and who is not. And of course, these are very important questions, particularly today, right? So he goes on and he talks about the media industries, right? He begins with a discussion of the media industries. And here, when he's using this term media industries, it's not quite the culture industry of Adorno and Horkheimer, but it's close, right? You can tell that he's got a little bit of that Adorno and Horkheimer way of thinking in him. And of course, the media industries themselves are powerful forces in contemporary societies. Think about all the influence that the media industries have through social media, through films, through television shows and websites and so on, right? And so Kellner is a big advocate of what we call media literacy. So that idea is that people need to understand how these media industries work, right? Specifically, that he wants people to understand how they influence us, right? And how they actually transform our environment in a way, right? So he feels that people need to understand this. He calls this media literacy. And he believes that this will help make people more well-rounded human beings, but also better citizens, right? Better citizens of the world. So then the question becomes, well, what exactly do the media industries do? And the answer is they make entertainment, but they don't just do that. They also produce news. They share information. And generally, the way that they survive is through advertising. Right? Now, this isn't always true, right? We have organizations like HBO, for example, that function through subscription services. But for the most part, even today, these organizations survive through advertising. And they help to reproduce a media and consumer society. So what he's saying there is that, of course, we live in a media society to the extent that we're just saturated with it. It's everywhere. You literally, even if you threw away your phone, and just drove home, right? You'd have to take the radio out of your car. You'd have to not look at all the billboards on the side of the road to even make it, a 30-minute drive from school back to your house without encountering media. It's literally everywhere. And so we live in this media-saturated environment, and because of the ads, because ads are what drives so much of this media, then, of course, it's constantly encouraging us to consume, to buy this cereal, or to buy this car, or right, to buy these sneakers or these clothes, right? So because the media and advertising are so closely linked, what you have is a combination media and consumer culture. And so then finally, he says, that the media industries act as an economic force. They help to manage consumer demand, or a better way of saying this might be that they help to create consumer demand, constructing needs and fantasies through advertising and entertainment that work to create this consumer society that we live in. So, what he's saying here when he says constructs needs, for example, is that, in essence, these ads make us feel like we need products that perhaps we didn't even think of prior to seeing the advertisement, right? Now, I need to be careful with my own language because I say that these ads make us. Now, it's important to recognize that media can't make you want or believe or think anything. And so I need to be careful with my language. It's easy to talk that way, but it's not accurate. What media does and what ads do is that they encourage you to think a certain way, right? So when you watch these ads, maybe for a new car, you think, oh man, I really need that. I really need a new car, don't I? And that need is false. It's superficial, right? Your old car is fine, but you feel like you need it when actually you just want it. So really what it does is it constructs wants, and it does this through fantasies. Oh yeah, imagine me driving down the street in a new Mercedes, right? So what he's saying here is that the media industry builds this consumer society by encouraging us to want things and fantasize about different kinds of products. So then what is Kellner doing exactly in this essay? So what he's doing, right? Number one, he discusses the potential contributions of what he calls a critical media/cultural studies perspective to theorizing about these media industries. He then goes on and he talks about the history of cultural studies, all the different, in academics, we're always standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us. So what he does is he kind of traces the development of cultural studies through these different schools. So he starts off talking about the Frankfurt School, which you're already familiar with because of our reading of Adorno and Horkheimer and Benjamin. Then he talks about the Birmingham Center of British Cultural Studies. And this was, of course, in England, but was sort of the heir to the throne of the Frankfurt School, right? This was sort of like the next school that really took over in terms of furthering the study of culture. And then finally, he offers a model of what he thinks would make a good critical media cultural studies approach to engage with the media industries. So finally then, and most importantly, he wants to stress the importance of critical analysis of both news and entertainment, right? So he separates news and entertainment, and the need to combine history, social theory, political economy, and cultural studies in order to contextualize, analyze, interpret, and criticize the products that the media industries are turning out. So what he's doing here, right, is he's calling for a really broad approach. And, in a way, this is kind of commonsensical because the bigger the lens that you use to examine something, the more you can see of it, right? So he wants to figure in history, social theory, the politics and economics, and the basic cultural studies approach in order to really get at what the media industries are doing. He does this then by beginning with the Frankfurt School, and he says, and you know a little bit about this already, but I'll still go over it. He talks about the Frankfurt School, and he says, it's in essence the Frankfurt School that begins critical communication studies in the 1930s, and it combined the study of political economy along with the study of the text themselves, textual analysis, and audience reception studies of social and ideological effects, right? And uses all these things to create a way of thinking that gives us the model for what becomes cultural studies, right, as a field. He points out this was organized around the German Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. Not everyone associated with the Frankfurt School worked at the German Institute for Social Research Studies. It's important to recognize that. However, many of them did. But of course, they left there because they had to go into exile towards the end of the 1930s. They left there and many went to the U.S. after Hitler took power because these were Jewish intellectuals, radical Jewish intellectuals who surely would have been rounded up and killed under the Nazi regime. So what they're doing, or what they did at the Frankfurt School, was to come up with a way to analyze the culture industry, right? Based on the idea that it operates as an institution of social hegemony, right? Now we've talked about hegemony and how hegemony works, which we know works through force, but perhaps more importantly and more insidiously, functions through ideology, right? And so they think, Adorno and Horkheimer and the other folks at the Frankfurt School believe that these culture industries are mechanisms of social control. And in that, they're serving as an instrument of the hegemons, right? It's part of this plan of social hegemony in an era that in essence is ruled by state monopoly capitalism. So that means, again, this idea of the capitalist state, and specifically what they're talking about is very much the kind of capitalism that we see in the United States today, where it's largely dominated by giant corporations, right? I mean, we're not talking about mom and pop corner stores. We're talking about a culture and society that's dominated by just a handful, really, of major corporations. For example, if we look at the media, there are only maybe 10 media companies that present you almost everything that you see, right? Disney owns a huge portion of everything, really, right? Fox, there are a few that we can name. It changes so often, though, that I hesitate to list the bunch because they're constantly changing. But again, there's only a handful of companies that pretty much control the entire media landscape. So that's an example of monopoly capitalism. So they also, oh geez, I messed up. They also analyzed the new forms of corporate and state power during a time in which, again, giant corporations ruled the capitalist economies, and the might of the state simultaneously grew under the guise of fascism in Europe, Russian communism in the Soviet Union, and the state capitalism of our President Roosevelt's New Deal, which required a sustained government response to the crisis of the Depression in the 1930s. So what they're saying here, what the Frankfurt School is responding to, is the growth of giant corporations that sort of dominate economies, right? As well as the growth of the state. And when I say the state, I mean government, right? And of course, the state varies according to which country you're in. But generally speaking, governments expanded and gained power during the 1930s and on, right, for the decades moving forward. And in the U.S., much of this, what they're saying, much of this expansion of government began with Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a program that was created by the government to get us out of the Great Depression, but shoveled huge amounts of money. The government shoveled huge amounts of money into the economy in an effort to get people employed and out of jobs, but at the same time also made the government much larger than it was beforehand. So, of course, the Frankfurt School also argued that ideology played a really important role in inducing consent, right? You remember Gramsci and the idea of spontaneous consent. So they're saying here that ideology is important because that's used to create consent. And they also argued that the media are controlled by groups who employed them to further their own interests and power. So this is their idea of the culture industries and the idea that state monopoly capitalism, in essence, runs the media industries. And all they're doing is perpetuating this ideology of state monopoly capitalism. And they were also the first to argue that the culture industries were at the center of leisure activity. So they acknowledged that people are spending all their time, at the movies or, later watching television and so on. And that these operate as agents of both socialization, right, and acted as what they call mediators of political reality, meaning that they shape the ideology, the worldview of the people that engage with their products, right? Whoops. Okay. So, the Frankfurt School, right, the thinkers of the Frankfurt School were one of the first neo-Marxist groups to examine the effects of mass culture, right, and the rise of this consumer society we've been talking about on the working classes, right? So what they did, they looked at all this culture industry stuff and said, listen, this is affecting the workers. And of course, according to Marx, the workers eventually were supposed to realize that they were getting the shaft in capitalism, that they weren't getting a good deal, that they were being exploited. And eventually they were supposed to rise up and have a revolution. That's what Marx always predicted. But see, that didn't happen. And so a lot of people who are Marxist thinkers moving forward had to grapple with, if I'm a Marxist, then what am I going to say about this, this big revolution that never happened? Well, the Frankfurt School thinkers were neo-Marxists, right? And they figured, listen, we got to explain why the revolution never came. And their answer to this question was that the working classes were engaged with the culture industries, that they were watching movies, listening to the radio, later watching TV, and that this constant ideological exposure made it so that they never revolted, right? They were just constantly indoctrinated with this stuff, and as a result generated what Marx would call a false consciousness, and they never really understood that they were getting screwed, right? So the Frankfurt School thinkers theorized this, but they wanted to dig further. I mean, I'm painting it in broad strokes, but they also wanted to look further at how, what exactly does this exposure do to the working classes? What does living in a consumer society do to poor people, right? And of course, you can see a lot of this today, right? We all know poor people or people that are working class who spend enormous amounts of money on luxury goods, right? Supreme, Louis Vuitton, expensive cars when they live in crappy apartments or crappy houses, and so on, right? The Marxist thinkers, the neo-Marxist thinkers of the Frankfurt School would say, well, all that's because they live in this consumer society, right? And they've been driven to want and believe they need these goods that they really don't, right? And so as a result, they spend their money on these silly things, and instead of saving it, and they're always poor, right? They never get out of the hole that they're in. Now, so this is according to the article, all the good things that the Frankfurt School has done for media theory, but he also outlines some of the problems with the thinking of the Frankfurt School. And so he says, listen, the Frankfurt School approach needs to be updated, and specifically, it needs to be updated. We need better analysis of the political economy of the media. We need to think more about these issues of regulation, who owns what, right? All these kinds of questions. We need to look more carefully into the process of production, how these cultural productions are made, right? The construction of the media industries themselves, how they're put together, and how they interact with other social institutions throughout history, right? So how does TV? This is an example of this might be how we read about Hartley, right? And Hartley's idea of TV as transmodern teaching. That's an historical view that looks at TV as replacing another institution, mainly the church, as a form of teaching, right? So Hartley wants more of this. I'm sorry, Kellner wants more of this. And he also says, listen, they need to really look at audience reception and media effects. In other words, they need to look at how people really make sense of the stuff that they watch and read, right? Because if you look at Adorno and Horkheimer, their argument is just that, the culture industry churns all this stuff out, we consume it, and it brainwashes us, right? But what Kellner is saying here is, nah, listen, we really need to look at how people go. We need to ask people. We need to go figure out how they really make sense of the media that they're seeing. Because now, after reading Stuart Hall, we know that people don't always agree with these messages. That sometimes they agree a little bit, and sometimes they resist those messages too, right? He goes on, he says, we need to get rid of the distinctions between mass culture and high art as well. Right? The idea is that this is too snobby. He says that people like Adorno and Horkheimer looked at cultural productions, things like movies and so on, as lowbrow for the lower classes, and differentiated between that and what they would call real art or high art, things like classical music and so on, right? And what Kellner is saying, no, that's not a good way to do it. We need to stop making these distinctions and be willing to study culture more broadly, right? We can't say that all low culture is ideological and all high culture is okay. Again, the idea that TV shows and movies and so on are low culture and therefore filled with this capitalist state ideology. But high culture is fine. We can't say that. We have to look at it all the same, and we also have to make room for how people really engage with media text. We got to make room for negotiated and oppositional readings as well as dominant readings. So from the Frankfurt School, moving on, the next big step in the development of cultural studies came with British cultural studies from the University of Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, right, or the BCCCS. These guys were heirs to the traditions of the Frankfurt School, and they worked during the 60s and 70s, so about 30 or 40 years after the Frankfurt School. And they focused on the interplay of representations and ideologies of class, gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality in cultural texts, including media culture. So they expand things, right? They're just not looking at it in terms of capitalist ideology. They're also thinking about things like gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, and seeing how these things are represented in the products of the culture industries, right? So in other words, how do movies, TV shows, books, videos, etc., help us think of ourselves in terms of our gender, our race, our ethnicity, etc.? So one of the reasons they're important is that they were among the first to study the effects of things like newspapers, radio, television, and film. And the effects or rather not, I don't want to say the effects, I know that I wrote that here, but really how people engage with these things, right? Media effects studies are different than this. Here what we're really dealing with, what they're trying to get at is, they were some of the first people who really went to audiences, sat down with them, and said, now that you've seen this program, what do you think about it? Do you agree with the messages in it? Do you disagree with them? And tell us more, right? So they went out and really dealt one-on-one with real people. And so this is called audience reception studies, and British cultural studies pretty much started this, right? And so that's why we're interested in them, right? They focused on how these audiences interpreted and used media culture differently, right? How different kinds of people in different, class levels or different levels of society or different subcultures made sense of the messages that the media gave them, right? And so they analyzed the factors that made different audiences respond in different ways to a variety of media texts. Now, these guys were also neo-Marxists, but they were also, influenced by Althusser and Gramsci, who we've read, right? We've read both these guys. So they liked the ideas of Marx, and they sort of added Gramsci and Althusser to Marx to give them a kind of a lens to view culture through. So they improved, many people would say, on the Frankfurt School by rejecting high and low distinctions when it comes to cultural artifacts. So they're not interested in high culture and low culture. They also imagine what we call an active audience. So the active audience is the audience that can reject a message if they want, right? So when we talk about active audiences, there used to be an idea when I was a kid, for example, that when you watch TV, you were just a couch potato, just sitting there, not really doing anything. But that isn't how being a part of an audience really works, right? When we're part of an audience, we're watching a show, we're constantly making sense out of it, right? We call this making meaning in communications. And so, we're making meaning out of the shows that we see. And they understand that the audience is active. They're not just being brainwashed. They're thinking about the messages that they're getting, right? And then they also wanted to link theory to practice. So the idea here is that, the people involved in British cultural studies were very interested in helping groups that have been marginalized, right? And so as a result, they're taking their theory and they felt like there was a need to put it into practice. And when you put theory into practice, this is called praxis, right? And so they didn't just want to study theory. They actually wanted to help make social change, help empower people in oppressed groups. And so they looked at media as forms of control, but they also looked at it as ways to resist control, right? As tools to fight against oppression. So this puts a new spin, obviously, on Adorno and Horkheimer, who just saw media as forms of control, right? They rebelled against the British class system, which was much more intense, for lack of a better term, than ours, right? Because they literally had an aristocracy, right? King, queen, dukes, earls, so on, right? And they looked, specifically to the working classes of Great Britain and the youth as possible agents of social change. They thought, well, listen, these seem like two really good groups that would be open to our messages, who are already kind of resisting a lot of the dominant messages that they're getting from the ruling class. And maybe we could put our theory to work with these groups in order to create social change. So British cultural studies also appropriated emerging analyses of gender, race, sexuality, and brought in a whole host of different critical theories into their study. So they're not just interested, again, in issues of ideology when it comes to power. They're also interested in questions like gender, questions of gender, race, sexuality, etc., right? And so their approach contained an implicit critique of all cultural forms that promoted oppression, right? They didn't like oppression at all and wanted to stand up for all the marginalized groups they could find. And so they wanted to criticize these texts that committed this oppression while positively affirming texts and representations that could create a more just and kind of egalitarian social order. So again, these folks were really interested in actually making social change. They were interested in helping a wide variety of marginalized groups, and they were interested in how media figured into this entire kind of scenario, right? So even for all these good intentions, there were some problems with British cultural studies. There's an overemphasis on reception and textual analysis. And at least for Kellner, he says they didn't pay enough attention to questions of political economy, so the politics and the economics of it. And so as a result, this kind of study could degenerate into a kind of populism, right, that focuses too much on the pleasures of the popular and not enough on questions of social class and ideology. So then Kellner says, well, what was the best about these things? And he says, at their best, both the Birmingham Center and the Frankfurt School had a three-pronged approach, right? A three-way approach to studying the production and political economy of culture, cultural text, and reception. And because it's three-pronged, this kind of approach avoids a narrow focus on only one dimension, right? And so Kellner says, let's go back to this three-pronged approach, but let's emphasize the political economy angle of it, right? Let's put special emphasis on the politics and the economics of these approaches. And so he goes on, he says, listen, political economy calls attention to the fact that production, distribution, and reception of culture take place within a specific economic and political system. This is your political economy, right? Constituted by relations between the state, the economy, social institutions and practices, culture, and organizations like the media. So what he's saying here is, listen, it's great to look at production, distribution, and reception, but when we do that, we have to acknowledge that all of these things take place within a socio-political system. And so we need to examine that system too. Because if we don't know the context, then we don't really have the full answers. So he goes on and says, listen, political economy isn't just about economics, right? It deals with relationships between the economic, the political, technological, and cultural dimensions, right, of the social context in which the media industries function. So again, it deals not just with economics, politics, technology, and the cultural dimensions, right, of the social milieu. in which the media industries operate. And he goes on, he says, listen, we need to look at old media and new media. And ultimately, even if we're just primarily interested in textual analysis, even if we're just interested in, let's say, analyzing one film, understanding all these other things, right? The economics, the politics, the technology, understanding the context for that movie helps give us a richer textual analysis, right? It gives us a bigger picture, ultimately. Now, he goes on, he says, political economy by itself can be reductive, right? So when he says reductive, he means that it can make things oversimplified, right? It can be seen as arguing, like Adorno and Horkheimer do, that media culture just reflects the ideology of the ruling elite. And he says, no, we can't look at it that way. Instead, we need to look at society and culture as contested terrains. So remember when I said that hegemony must be constantly negotiated, right? That to stay in power, there's always a constant battle to maintain hegemony, right? There's always a constant negotiation going on. And so what Kellner's saying here is that society and culture is the battleground, right? Where this hegemony is being constantly negotiated, where the war for control is constantly going on. And so it's here that battles are fought over gender, race, sexuality, ideology, right? Our values, our culture. All these values all these different factors are constantly negotiated in society and culture, right? So he says you can't just understand the media industries as a reflection of the ideology of the ruling elite, right? Because society and culture are more complicated than that. We're not just a bunch of brainwashed people. We're a bunch of people who make up a society where we're constantly battling, constantly negotiating over these different issues. So ultimately then, what he wants to do is he wants to create a critical media industry studies, is what he calls it, right? And so he wants to explore entertainment, news, and information. He wants to combine political economy with sociology and cultural studies, right? So the sociology aspect, by the way, are things like the audience reception angle of it, right? And he says, listen, we can't even think of news and entertainment as separate categories anymore, right? We live in the world of infotainment now, right? The media industries have combined all these different genres or categories of information in ways that they've never existed before, right? And he says, what my approach would do is it would let me attack bias against social groups and criticize texts that promote oppression. This approach will illuminate how media artifacts advance or oppose political movements and positions. It would increase our freedom and individuality by creating an informed audience, and ultimately help people struggle for alternative cultures and political change. So you could see, right, Kellner's an optimist. Where Adorno and Horkheimer are cynics or pessimists, Kellner is an optimist. And he says, listen, if we take a wide enough approach and we understand society and culture in the right way, then we can help people who have been oppressed and change our society for the better. So that's a wrap, guys. Thank you for checking out my video, and I hope I explained it adequately and that you learned something.